But it costs a lot per piece, so.
And so today's discussion, and again, since there's we're the small track, I think we can have more of a discussion. Stop me and interrupt me. Today's discussion is kind of a reflection on my personal journey. I've been doing the security thing since the first Clinton administration. I got my start at PSINet. Originally, my job was to start trying to sell people T1s, which were horribly expensive at the time. And T3s were, that was the great white whale in terms of getting people connected to the internet. And they took me aside right out of college, and they said, well, okay, you did a good job with that for 60 days, but what we'd like to do is there's this thing called a firewall, and we want you to start explaining to people why they need these firewall things, because most people just had a Cisco 2600, if that, with some static packet filtering on it, right? And we wanted to upsell 50 grand for Gauntlet, or at least 5 grand for a Morningstar box. I just dated myself. So that's where I started. Currently, I work for the smallest of the too big to fail banks. Up until Friday, my role there was technology and operational risk management, governance and compliance. So it was a lot of info risk, it was a lot of op risk. If you're familiar with banking and financials, that includes physical and fraud and a bunch of other stuff. Starting Monday, I'll actually move to owning information insurance, so vuln scanning, our red team, security engineering operations, keep IT GRC, the op risk stuff goes to somebody else downtown, thank goodness. But that's kind of my path. In between then, I've been a product manager, I've been a consultant, I've had a lot of fun. I used to work at a company called Verizon where we did the data breach report. I was part of that team, as well as I did some other stuff there. So this talk was focused on the burnout question, because a lot of my friends on the Twitter or over drinks were talking about how they've gotten to this similar late 30s, early 40s part of their career, and they're just done. And I see a lot of CISOs whose sole goal in life is to stop being a CISO, but make the same salary level, right? So that was part of it. As I've given this talk a couple times now, I was fortunate enough to do it at B-Sides Las Vegas and Source Seattle. A lot of folks who may not be burned out, but may be starting a career or trying to develop their career, they said they got a lot out of this too. So while this slide is going to talk about burnout, I think I hope that the concepts here are multi-applicable. So real quick, I'm not trying to trivialize anything here. It's a real and potentially devastating problem to figure out that you're in your late 40s, early 50s. You've got about 15 years of money making left in your life, and this is where you sit, right? Burnout is very real, and it sucks. And we're losing extremely talented people every year to burnout, either physically or mentally. And the last thing is, this is not a panacea. I'm not a professional. This is just my personal journey, okay? And don't be like, this is not self-help either. I'm not here to sell you a book and get you into my paracult. All I can do is tell you what works for me.
But he does have a 14-step program. It's a cheap
That's
monthly
right.
thing from PayPal. It's not a big deal.
Just sign up for the recurring charge. All right, so, I'm not an expert, right? I'm doing this because, generally I love everybody that I interact with on Twitter and at conferences and at bars. You guys, my friends, I believe in what we do. I believe it's, really, the whole reason I got into the internet was my dad was like, hey, he was, before it was commercialized, he was on it as a scientist, and he was like, this is going to be a big deal. You might want to look into it. And I kind of caught the love. So I believe in the discipline. I believe in securing, and that we're going to help Western civilization with what we do in the long term. I mean, as long as there is a civilization at this point, there'll be something that smells like our internet, right? So I like what I do in that way, but that doesn't make day-to-day grind any easier, right? So let's just talk about burnout real quick. These are causes that I swiped right off of Mayo Clinic, right? Google's your friend. The first that they point out is a lack of control, right? And as I went through all of these causes, it just hit me why we might feel this way as an industry. Lack of control. Who controls the threat environment? Ain't nobody who does, really. We don't control that. We hardly control the products that we use, right? You've got that product manager, for those of you who saw that silly slide earlier, you've got that person controlling to some extent what you buy and implement and to defend your network. So that's, lack of control is very difficult, and I think we suffer from that. We don't own all the inputs. Moreover, just who here is in security and has trouble with IT? You're lying if you don't raise your hand, right? No, it's true, right? Sometimes we don't even control what IT does. We don't control what the business wants, right? Some people ask me what I do on a daily basis, and I say, well, generally the business sometimes wants to stick a fork in a socket, and my job is to tell them that might not be a great idea. Or if they really are heck bent on it, how they might survive that encounter, right? So there's a lack of control there that I think we end up with. Some unclear job expectations is another symptom of burnout, right? Unclear job expectations are kind of rampant, right? I mean, to some degree, if we're working as a firewall admin or we're in security engineering and operations, right? Your expectation is to work your tickets, right? That's straightforward. But if you think about what we do in general as a security department or security practitioner, the expectations that your CFO or CEO have of you may not line up with reality. My CFO, CFO, too big to fail bank. He emails me every so often with a phishing attempt that he identified, right? And so he goes, this one slipped through your firewalls. Okay, thanks. So he has this expectation that my firewalls are going to stop phishing emails, 100% of the time. That's, no matter how many times I explain to him, look, we're at X, 99.X% effectiveness here. It still gets to his email box. Dysfunctional workplace dynamics. We brought up IT recently. I mean, heck, even security can get siloed. I've got silos personally between different areas of fraud, more or less different areas of security and different areas of fraud, right? So check fraud, bank card fraud, wire fraud, that sort of thing. So dysfunctional workplace dynamics are another reason for that. And that only gets worse when anybody ever tried to discuss a vulnerability with the business owner. They have no idea what you're doing and they absolutely don't want to fix it, right? Yeah, that's dysfunction. I dread those conversations. Similarly, a mismatch in values. And this works both ways in my experience. Many times we get very, very caught up in how clever we are, the romanticism of red teaming, right? And that's cool and it's useful, and I'm not here to demean that. I'm going to be owning the red team function tomorrow, I guess. But we have this mismatch between we think we're really clever and we're providing value, and the business is like, I have to go make profits now, right? Both of which are incredibly important, but they all tend to be mismatched unless we really take a lot of effort to have those discussions and talk risk, right? Poor job fits. How many people in here started out with security as their first choice in their career? How many people have a degree from a college in InfoSec? Did you get that straight out of school, Jake?
Masters.
Yeah. So we can now get MBAs and such and all that stuff, and there are kids graduating with InfoSec degrees. But most of us, and looking around the room, most of us, our age groups, we went to school for something completely different. We just kind of fell into this, and we may or may not love it, right? So is it a fit for our skills? or did we fall into this and kind of like it? Extremes of activity is another one. You're very busy, then you got nothing to do, right? Many security departments, as I've been a consultant over the last 10 years, I'm not anymore, but when I was, many of them work from fire drill to fire drill, right? It's, oh my gosh, here's this problem, let's go triage that problem and deal with it, versus, it's very much like a development shop. Unless you really make time to manage towards internal work and planned work, as well as address this unplanned work, you're going to suffer from these extremes of activity, and that's going to continue to contribute to burnout. A lack of social support, and I don't mean talking to Jack on Twitter, right, or having drinks with Jake. I mean, when you're at the office and people don't understand what you do or who you are,
Or what you're saying.
or what you're saying.
No.
Yeah, project managers are a great example. I've got this project manager who's sending me emails last Friday about how we're going to cause his deadlines to be missed. And the fact of the matter is, the app's not ready, right? We're not testing it because your developers say the app's not ready and it's not going to be ready for another week, right? But it's that I have no support from that project manager right now. And a work-life imbalance, right? And anybody who's worn the pager, that's kind of an outdated, I just showed my age again. But anybody who's I've got an email box full of 700 freaking alerts off of I think in the last 48 hours off of our network. I have to run through those and make sure there are no criticals there that I got to jump on. That's going to also contribute to burnout. So this is Mayo Clinic. I'll give some more specific ones, right? First, security is not easy.
What's funny is you say we're the pager, but we're at B sides, which predates the pager.
That's right. Yeah. So just some observations that security's not easy, right? It's not easy because we don't control the environment. It's not the threat, or for that matter, IT many times, right? Wow, what's that IP doing, and where'd that come from? Security is a cost center, and this is a key one, right? Anybody here ever been a CEO? Right? Okay, so just real quick, there are two ways that businesses create profit. One, they create new revenues, right, and do so profitably, or two, they cut expenses, right? And everybody knows that you have to cut expenses. We're a cost center. The intrinsic desire of a CFO is to keep us from spending money, right? That's it, as far as accounting is concerned. The last piece, I went through this. The last piece is that the benefits of security are not directly observable. They're not. If we're doing our job, nobody freaking knows in the business, right? I had to explain this to some folks, and we'll get into this a little easier, or a little later today. What you provide is no experience at all to the end user, or to management for that factor. And the only work product that you're presenting to the business is a report. So why do our reports suck? Right? That was the next question. We spent a lot of time working on our reports because of that. So some personal causes, as I reflected on this, some personal causes that I have that kind of I have to reflect on when I'm not feeling like I'm doing my best, or not feeling like I'm very motivated to go to work that morning is, first is this kind of Western expectation of self-fulfillment, right? I expect the ticker tape parade, right? I want palms lied down on the way to my office because I'm securing the world, right? That's me. Hey, no incidents at the bank yet. That's a very Western, self-aggrandizing, egoist expectation. I have poor expectations of my audience sometimes. What do I mean by poor expectations of my audience? I expect them to get security. I expect them to get how clever I am. I expect them to get those sweet risk models I've built, the sweet threat models I've built, right? The fact that I'm one of the few people who are really digging into data for them, all this cool stuff. And at the end of the day, they're worried about where they're going for lunch because I've got an 11:30 appointment with them. A lack of experience. We talked a little bit about this, just now. How many of us are really trained to do this? We've learned on the job. And if you say, hey, here's some new concept, right? The experience that we've got is all. It's not like this is woodworking where we've been doing it for millennia as a society. It's a very, very new, in general, it's a very new industry. It's a very new job function. We all suffer at times, I think, from imposter syndrome, if you're familiar with that, right? But because there aren't a lot of experts that you can point at and say this person really is the very wisest of the wise, and whatever they say is truth coming out of their mouth, we tend to look upon ourselves and be like, I have no idea if I'm doing right or wrong. There's nobody I can bounce this off of. You talk to people who have been doing this for longer than us, sometimes 30, 40 years, and they're like, yeah, sucks to be you, right? That contributes to this lack of self-confidence at times. I have a personal stubbornness as well, which is, I'm not going to let go. I think the business is putting a fork in a socket, and I'm going to do everything I can to stop you, regardless of how much profit you think you're going to make, right? It is that where I actually, and this is part of it, I personally feel the need sometimes to be that expert, right? You've called me into the boardroom for my opinion and my expertise, and so I feel the need to be the expert on this and tell you about all the ways that you're going to electrocute yourself with fork-in-socket syndromes as they're pervasive throughout the enterprise, right? So you've got some, as I've reflected, right, these were some things that I realized contributed to, not necessarily burnout, but those days where I was like, man, I don't want to do this anymore. So at one point, I ran across something, which is kind of the crux for the talk here, and it's this concept of craftsmanship. I'm not going to butcher the Japanese word for it. That there is an actual term. And I came across it because there was a movie about this guy. Has anybody seen the movie? Guy in the back, great. If you haven't, it's really worth it. It's a great movie. And essentially, this man's name is JIRO. And if I call him JIRO today, forgive me, because we're trying to figure out what to do with our ticket system as we transition on Monday. So just bear with me. I've had JIRO on the mind for the last couple weeks. But JIRO basically is this, he's more than 85 years old now, but he's this very old sushi chef. He's still going at it as far as I know. 3 Michelin stars, which is ridiculous for sushi. And if you, and it's even more ridiculous when you see his restaurant, which is basically this very small, innocuous sushi restaurant that's in like the Tokyo subway. It's not at the top of some building, overlooking a great view. It's not in the trendiest parts of neighborhoods. It's literally this thing right there in the subway. So it's a very interesting. It's very interesting because what this movie does is it goes through why does this guy, who generally has no real characteristics in terms of marketing and being a foodie and all that stuff, why is he so darn successful, right? And if you see this tagline, fall in love with your work, and that concept of craftsmanship, that's what becomes apparent when you watch it. And I'll give you this clip. So here you have this 85-year-old guy, and if you watch it, you'll see things like, when it comes time to massage octopus, he does it for like 37 minutes or something. If I got that wrong, sue me. Not 30, not 40, right? He has taken the time to learn his craft, to learn exactly what the feedback loop is from his customer is. And he will sit there, and it's very fun if you watch the movie, he will sit there and watch the customer chew, right? Looking for any hint in their face, whether they've found something displeasurable or pleasurable at that point, right? So to me, I started realizing, like, holy crap, what am I focusing on? I'm focusing on me. I'm focusing on the secure thing. I'm focusing on being the hero, right? I'm not focusing on actual craftsmanship. I never thought of myself as that, right? I wanted to think of myself as an expert, sure, but the focus was still me, not the craft, not the product that I was delivering to the business. And remember, the business is interested in not having a product experience for the most part. Again, it's about creating excellence in the eyes of your audience, right? That's the key. Our audience isn't Twitter. Our audience isn't Black Hat, DEF CON, B-Sides Orlando, right? Our audience are those people who pay our paychecks, right? Who have hired us to protect them and serve them. And yet, sometimes, we don't really act that way. In fact, if we want to carry this chef analogy a little further, sometimes we act more like Gordon Ramsay, right, here, than we do this, somewhat humble 85-year-old guy, right? To me, because we end up screaming, hey, you're sticking a fork in the socket. I use that analogy on purpose to get to this point to say, that's a ridiculous way of looking at it. Like, you're sticking a fork in the socket, and I know that's stupid, and you're like, I can trust you about as much as I trust my 2-year-old son, right? So it's about mindset to me. And this is something I have to remind myself of every day, because I get in the way of the mindset. With all apologies to Ron Swanson, I've got kind of a new life coach when I think about my career. So there's a couple of things that he talks about in this, and I'll just in this movie about what it means to be a craftsman. We'll just run through a few of these here. First is, you must keep an obsessiveness about you, right? And you saw him say you must fall in love with your work, right? But it's critical to know that obsessiveness is not about you, right? The title comes from this quote: in dreams I have grand visions of sushi, right? And it's not dreaming of work. Like when I was 16, my first job was at McDonald's, right? And I worked at the fry station for the very first time, and I worked a 6-hour shift. And by the end of the 6-hour shift, I went home and I tried to go to sleep, and all I heard was the freaking fry beeper going off, right? I couldn't even sleep. As exhausted as I was, I've never worked as hard in my life. That was not a pleasant dream, right? He's got grand visions in his dream, which is kind of interesting. And also, again, about that, it's the detail, right? The devil is in the details. If you give a deliverable to the business that includes visualizations, and you haven't read Stephen Few, right? There's a great play. That's an example. It's a great thing to think about, right? Second, Strunk and White, right? If your deliverable includes copy, right? If you haven't thought about how people consume and the room in which they're going to consume your deliverable and their mind, all the possible mindsets, right? All of that stuff. Now, the product, I've talked about the product here, but that's the result of the craft. That's why you go through and you look for great examples on data visualization. You work on your writing skills and your communication skills. So the next thing is it's dedicating your life to mastering that skill. In other words, it can't be a transient journey. You could become a craftsman to some degree, think of yourself as a craftsman, and have a second career, and that's fine, right? But in his opinion, it's a life journey. This other concept that the Japanese idea of craftsmanship relays is something that we're going to have to deal with, whether you like it or not, based on the evolution of the threat landscape, is that it's always learning and listening, right? And to some degree from a humble mindset as well. Right? Understand that some of us who are older, some of these kids that are going to come out, they're going to have a different perspective. If you ever get in a room with a bunch of crusty old CISOs, they worry about millennials and introducing them to the workforce, because the cloud is just how you do computing to them, right? This whole crunchy perimeter control, we own the data, that's oblivious to them. Privacy is another thing, right, that they worry about. So anyway, he does not think or feel like he's achieved perfection. That's an ongoing thing. Even though if you talk to food critics who are familiar with sushi, they're like, hey, this guy and his craft is a one in millennial event. When he goes, we lose it all, right? Part of the movie, if you watch it, is about this succession and his sons, right? And the fact that there's nothing they can do, and this is kind of the neat tension that makes it a cool movie too. There's nothing that they can do to achieve that perfection, right? Or near perfection, if you want to think of it that way. The other cool thing is it is about rebelling, right? It is about craftsmanship means not always following the way everything is done, right? It's great. Always doing what you're told doesn't mean you succeed in life, right? It's about trying to carve your own path and taking those risks, taking that personal risk. Sacrifices are made, but no regrets. Now he goes through when they get into this inner dynamic between him and his children. There's a lot there that I can't recommend. I do recommend a hearty work-life balance. But on the other hand, this is how his peers view him, right? Understanding that the sacrifices are going to have to be made in order to be a craftsman, but keep that, my goal is to keep that balance strong. I've got 5 kids, that can be difficult. It's again, for him, the journey isn't over. So it's a never-ending, always improving path. And we're, understanding how he can make and remember he said every detail. What even little refinements can you continue to make? One of the hardest for us is to love criticism, right? We feel the need to be experts in the room sometimes because we are the security guys. We know better than them. We know the audiences have no idea. I was sitting with what we're talking about and our experience and our knowledge base. I was sitting with a CISO a little while back, and I was talking to him about and talking about mentorship and leadership and these things. He said one of the most difficult things for him as a big company CISO is that there is nobody who can tell him how to do his job. Right? He can't go to the CIO and that guy tell him, oh, you're dealing with this security problem, here's how you deal with it. Right? Like you just can't. Right? The only way that you're going to actually find out from folks about how to do your job is to love criticism. Right? It's to get that feedback where you've done something and humbly acknowledge that you could do a better job next time. So a few things that I've found. It's that craftsmanship is not egocentric. One of the things that's been over the past 18 months since I started thinking about this in this way, one of the things that's been just wonderful for me to watch, and especially now that I'm losing the vast majority of my team, and watching them kind of graduate in that sense, is the fact that I devoted myself to making those guys better leaders. It got to a point in the last 4 months where I was just king of delegation. Right? It wasn't laziness, it was knowing that a transition was going to happen. I wasn't going to be there, letting them start to ride the training wheels themselves. I didn't have to be on every committee meeting. I didn't have to be at every work group. I didn't have to give every presentation. It was letting those guys really run with the ball. It was taking the lady who started out as a CISO, as the executive assistant to the CISO, and then she got moved over to do scheduling pen tests for us. And then I got her, and she was in charge of exception processes and to some degree setting up conversations still about the pen tests and vulnerabilities with risk analysts in the business. It was giving her new opportunities, whether in fraud detection and operation, or even just teaching her.
That's across the hall.
It could be, but even teaching her Tableau. For those of you familiar, Tableau is a data visualization tool, right? Sending her to Tableau classes, hooking up with basic data sets out of the vulnerability management process, that sort of thing, right? And now she's gone. She's not going to be reporting to me, but she's got a new set of skill sets and a new level of self-confidence. You know, I certainly could have created those reports, and I certainly could have done a hell of a lot better than she did for the most part, right? Because I've dedicated to that myself to those sorts of things. But that is, again, egocentric. And part of being a leader, the craftsmanship of being a security leader, was to impart these knowledges, no matter what skill set my analysts brought to the table. Which is hard for me because a handful of them come directly from audit. It's not being mean. This is also very difficult for me, which is kind of interesting, right? It's not being Gordon Ramsay. It's not telling people that they're freaking stupid. The other thing that I have to continually work through is that it's not a perfect world. That just because I'm thinking about the craft and not myself, and just because I'm trying to take this path here, it doesn't mean that things are going to be awesome all the time, right? It doesn't mean that I'm going to have an all hands given by the CEO at the same time that probably 25 or 30% of all of our staff is trying to watch NCAA tournaments online, and so the Unix load on our proxies is more than twice the number of processors we have. So it's not. You're still going to have those days, right? This isn't a path to unicorns and lollipops and candy canes. It's also not something you attain, right? This is not. If you look at JIRO and how he talks about he's still on a path, right? He's still doing this at 85. He doesn't consider himself being perfected yet. There aren't really power-ups here. It's not like you're going to get to this point and suddenly, you're in the intelligentsia of InfoSec. That's not the goal here, right? This is not about you. It's about who you decide to become. And that's a key piece for me, is that it's always, in my mind, a constant decision for me. And especially when you get in that meeting with that product manager or that marketing person that wants to put a whole bunch of PII out into a SaaS app that has no business doing business with a bank. I have to make a conscious decision here to be a craftsman and not to be a Gordon Ramsay. So a few things that I'll leave you with, and we'll call this section Cooking Like JIRO. Just a basic application at a high level. First, understanding your customer needs, right? So the question is, you ask yourself some questions. What is it that your customer needs, right? Many times that might be no experience at all. They need you to stay in the background, right? It may be they need to make decisions, and whether you like it or not. For example, now that the risk world has changed at the bank, we have a brand new, risk management committee function, right? And where it wasn't clear how much IT risk was a piece of that, I now know. I got 5 minutes. That's it. Actually, all of operational risk is 5 minutes. I get a portion of that 5 minutes. Let me correct myself there. The rest of it is all credit risk. It's all how are our loans performing and all that stuff. Why? Because it's multi-billion-dollar risk. At best, I'm a 9-figure risk, right? So what does my customer need? In 5 minutes, they need to make decisions. and now I have many customers, regulators are a customer to some degree, right? These product managers or software developers are customers as well. But in that case, right, I have to identify that customer needs to make good security decisions and understand their risk in 5 minutes. In fact, less than that, probably 2 minutes. And probably 10 seconds, because they're probably thinking about the email that they just read. Again, what is your work designed to do? Is your work designed to create a decision based on security? Is your work designed to provide a secure experience for the customer? Right? Focusing there and focusing there first helps you in that path. That's definitely understanding the customer's experience. So attaining excellence in the eyes of your audience. I'll give you the obligatory Apple example, right? What's a great customer experience slide deck without talking about Apple for a second? So this here, anybody remember these? Right? This was your state-of-the-art Samsung phone, smartphone in 2007, the first half of 2007. That's what it looked like, right? Anybody know what happened in the last half of 2007? Right? Completely different. And if you ever held one of those or ever dealt with one of those, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? And you know, if you again, I don't want to sound like a fanboy. I don't care to sound like a fanboy, but I think it's ridiculous to not say that this product was a revolution. It was a revolution because the experience was so much superior to that, right? When it came out, everybody's like, oh, it doesn't have keyboard. BlackBerry's going to crunch it, right? Where's BlackBerry now? Where's your BlackBerry now? But in all seriousness, right? What is the iPhone of pen testing reports? Right? How much of our pen test report are pages and pages of medium vulns that you know your CFO or your CRO or your CIRO, if you're a big enough company, are going to look at and go, I don't know, how many mediums make a high? I don't know, right? And to that case, understanding the product you deliver. So this is redacted, but this is an actual report that was given to me as something that we show. When I first got to the bank, I said, so what's our product look like? What are we giving to these people around risk, information security risk? Oh, well we've got the sweet dashboard. Let me show it to you, right? Here it is. Right? And there's hosts of yellows and greens and blues and stuff. And if you pretended you could see that these were asset categories or business processes or whatever they are, right? And you give this to your average CFO, right? They're going to see a whole lot of red, and they're going to be worried about that, and they're going to see some yellow, but you know, you get the blues and the greens, so that's cool, but he doesn't know how cool, right? Moreover, what are you focused on? So just using some data viz guidelines and you know experience, we turn that same thing into this. So in 5 seconds, you guys all just went boom, right there. Right? And I promise you, the same data, same stuff along here. Right? Now I come to this meeting prepared to have a discussion around the adequate and the mod high and their quantitative ranges that match this stuff. Right? And whether or not we worry about the moderates and so forth. But it's definitely a very different consumer experience, especially when you consider, you want to talk about this for 2 minutes, or you want to talk about that for 2 minutes with the CFO, right? This is a much easier conversation. And again, this is not something clever that I did. I just kind of read some Stephen Few books, subscribed to some DataViz blogs, and tried to apply this, right? So, and while I'm giving you a report, an executive report-based example, right? You think about, I'm getting this now, right? It's like I just had an email like, hey, we want to take away the firewall rules and restrictions. In fact, we just want to take the source code repositories and put them on the WAN, and the only control we want is Active Directory controls, right? You know, immediately I'm like, yeah, that's not flying. Fork socket, right, is where I went. You know, had to take a step back and say these are customers with an experience, and I have to balance experience with the rest of the business need. Now, in this case, my immediate email back was, you know, I want to I want to help, but I need to understand how big of a problem is this. Is this really hurting our time to market, or is this an inconvenience because we're a bank and we have a bureaucracy? I want to understand who's using it, how many people are using it, right? And I basically said this, we both now report to the same CIO, and my job is to balance our risk requirements with time to market. So if we're going to come up with a solution here, and it is to put all our source code available on the WAN, understand that our boss is going to have me and you in a room when the regulators come in and say, why was this done? So help me make that business case. Let's prepare for that conversation, right? Now they backed off. They went, oh yeah, I guess that sucks, right? But I committed to, well, you're asking for this because somebody didn't think, hey, if they're a developer, they're going to need access when they onboard. So great, when they onboard, just make that part of the initial request. They get a laptop, they get a phone, they get access to that subnet. Boom, right? So it was that level of experience through that. And that's that entire experience. So again, with firewall administration, I kind of jumped forward to that example, you'll excuse me. Another one was that I dealt with was definitely this. The hardest lesson I got was losing a huge customer when about 12 years ago or so. We had one of the world's largest credit unions as a customer of ours, and we had helped the CISO out, and she loved us. But then they had turnover. The CIO and his immediate staff all had resume building opportunities given to them. And they brought in a new guy named Chris Hoff, something like that, right?
Oh my God, not that guy.
Yeah, and so we handed him our pen test reports, which had been, great. And it wasn't just that large credit union, but it was a bunch of other credit unions we handed the same freaking report to, and everybody thought we were the bee's knees. We handed it to Chris Hoff, and he promptly fired us, right? And that's how I know Chris. There's the story of how I know Chris Hoff. But it was definitely this sort of the entire experience. We had thought that we were awesome at it. We were the leader for all credit unions in the world, right? And all that crap. And the fact of the matter is, somebody came from outside that universe and really set us on our butts. And to this day, I'm grateful for that. It's also going to be security decision support as an entire experience. Those of you who get to sit down, whether that's a decision that you make in the bullpen at a SOC, whether that's a decision you get to make with lines of business leaders about vulnerabilities, or whether that's decisions that happen at a C-level, right? Going in and understanding they've got to make this decision, or we've got to make this decision, right? People are going to balance. No decision is really that easy. People are going to balance pros and cons. How do I facilitate pros and cons with my knowledge as a craftsman and as an expert? Understanding the ingredients. So I'm going to give you a high-level understanding of the ingredients as I work them here. This comes to me from Jack Jones. When you're going into that conversation for decision support, folks are going to have, you're going to need to help them balance 4 different categories of information. The first is threat information, right? This is what we're kind of worried about. If we didn't have threats, we wouldn't have jobs, we wouldn't have these decisions to make. And I've given you kind of some classifications through Veris about what a threat means in case you're really wondering. Next are the assets, right? So you've got threats, now you've got assets. Server, desktops, workstations, people, that sort of thing. Money, PII, sensitive information. Controls, hey, there's controls, right? And then impacts, right? And these are categories of impacts. They're always useful to consider. What I was doing when I was talking to that guy about putting source code out there was I was like, okay, when we have an incident, the top 3, these direct costs, they're going to be similar to a lot of other incidents that we have. But we have the potential for fines and judgments. Even if that is just what they call a matter requiring attention for banks, which means that we get to spend a whole lot of efforts trying to put all of this network segregation back in place after we took it away, it still costs money. Competitive advantage. Well, if our source code gets out, that's not going to be a happy day. But it's not like, you know, we're making defibrillators or rocket surgeons or anything like that. You know, how people borrow money from the Fed is typically well known. So there's not going to be a lot of that. But there may be some big reputation damage because our source code got out. But there'll definitely be some operational cost increases because you can't just fix it to the prior state. You have to show that you're doing a much better job than you were before. And that means money spent. Brief example of the operational increases. So a retailer many years ago got breached. It was a big breach. If I told you retailer's name, you'd know. A lot of my friends from Nationwide went over there. In fact, one good one became their CISO. And they were like, wow, we had a breach. And I was told that there was a lot of investment in all this stuff. What I didn't know was that what the breach created was $54 million in shelfware. Right? They had literally spent millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars on stuff, but never staffed it up, just to show, hey, we bought this. And you guys know this. Hey, we got a SIM, and it sits over there. Try not to turn the monitor on, right? So anyway, impacts. So you've got all of these 4 different categories. Now, when you put them together in a conversation or a scorecard or a quantitative forecast, then you get risk. And only then will you get risk. And only then will you really be talking to the business and giving them that full picture, right? Then will you only be able to have that discussion in the SOC bulkhead. Now, sometimes the impact piece you don't really need that much. You can say, hey, we all know that if the web server containing, you know, if the e-commerce server gets breached, we're going to have a bad day. You know, bad day is sometimes all the qualitative risk statement that you need there in terms of impact. But it's important to know that many times we focus on other pieces of this. And you may have great conversations. Some of the most meaningful conversations happen here, right? Why is a threat interested in these assets and how are they going to get at them? So that we can then have this conversation here about the controls. But you can't do that without that purple circle context. So that's just a basic thing, you know, whether I'm talking to this guy who wants to put source code out or whether I'm talking to you know, folks to try and justify upgrading our proxy infrastructure, I've got to bring all 4 circles to the table, because if I don't, right, I'm not going to be giving them the best product or the best experience or the best information to create a decision, which is really that product or experience. So the last piece I'll leave you with here is create and use a feedback loop, and I should say without ego. That's the most difficult part for me. It's definitely to be able to listen and have people say, hey, my security experience sucks. You know, we simply can't do that because that's going to hurt the business. Or even if the business is just too afraid, right? You know, so as an example, we're trying to get a browser plugin that defeats malware more widely adopted by our end user customers, not people inside the bank, but the people actually use online banking, right? Because it's going to stop wire fraud and it's got all these benefits. And the business came back and said, there's no way you can make this mandatory. Our customers will leave us. And I said, well, hold on a second. There's a whole lot involved in leaving a bank. You're going to tell me that people are going to get so frustrated with downloading a browser plugin that they're going to move banks. And the business is like, yeah, they'll totally leave us. I'm like, okay, great. Now, what I took from that was, no, people aren't going to leave us if we make this browser plugin mandatory. What I took from that is the business is really frightened of the user experience. It's not that they don't want the fraud to occur, right? Or it's not that they want the fraud to occur. What they want is for the end users to have a more seamless experience. And so rather than demanding the browser plugin, what we actually negotiated was more time in the back end for anti-fraud analytics for certain customer sets. Right? We went back and we did more work and we presented basically a much better experience for both the end user and the business. So, We have a few minutes left, I suppose. I've kind of given you what's worked for me or how I've thought about some things. I'd love to hear from you about your experiences. Please.
Interesting. So I want to go back to where you were talking about when you have CEOs or CFOs and they give you, basically not ultimatums, but this is the direction we're going to go. How do you approach that? You've given some discussions, as far as security, and where they don't have any interest in it. I mean, how do you kind of approach that?
Sure. So, and we'll throw this into the aggregate topic of aligning security with the business, which is like one of the hardest things that we could ever hope to do, because we're a cost center. Right? And in their eyes, we know more support profit than this room would, right? Because we're cost centers. And so forth. However, somebody was able to make the business case that will put more butts over there into rooms if we have one of these, and so that's why this expense and keeping up this expense with this beautiful rug and these wonderful chandeliers, right? But that's why it makes sense to have these expenses. So with that said, and I get this a lot from folks who might want to create metrics, is to listen very, very closely. A lot of times your executive levels will tell you, here's what we're trying to do. Now many times we'll get on that all hands call or we'll read that 4-paragraph email and you'll get these keywords and we'll go, oh, all right, great. Especially if we've had a lot of executive turnover, right? It's like, okay, here's another guy who's really thinks he's going to change the world. But the fact of the matter is he's at the top here disconnected and we're all down there. Right? But when you get called into that room and listening to the goals of the business, they're going to give you clues as to what you do. And so my suggestion and my tactic, and we talked a little bit about this, interestingly enough, at the beginning of today. I don't know if you were here or not, but is to say, okay, great. Well, let me have a conversation with you about how I can support that. And what I'll do is I will go through a mind mapping exercise that is related to goal, question, metric, right? With the idea being, hey, I can give you either a report or an ongoing scorecard or whatever, but I can also be willing to talk to you, because if you take a goal and you start asking yourselves these questions about how you hit that goal in order to create metrics, well, you don't have to necessarily go through the metrics, but you can say, hey, look, if the idea here is to help us with, let's just call it mobile computing, right? Pick a problem, any problem. But if it's around mobile computing, what I can do is this. I can tell you I will support that goal with or without modest expense to you, right? But what we have to consider is we have to start considering if we're going to let people do that, well, we might have some problems. Right? Now, I'm not going to overestimate that, right? I'm not going to go say, oh my gosh, iOS boxes have the same degree of anti-malware as our desktops do. A, that's not going to happen, right? But B, the threat environment just isn't necessarily there yet, depending on what kind of business you're in. There may or may not be spend here. It may be process level controls, right? So on and so forth. But here's how I'm going to support this, there, and this is the cost to you. And if you want, you can financially engineer an annualized loss expectancy or whatever, right? But even if you just say, hey, the reason to do this is because I don't want this initiative to get derailed and or get even paused, right? And the way that's going to happen is if we have a bad security day, right? And that's where most people will think of security as a subset of risk management, right? Because if they want to do this whole, hey, we're going to go do empower mobility here, right? Great. Let me help you manage to that risk. I'm not going to try and secure mobile, but I'll do that. And so just coming to them with a handful of, here's how I can help. That's really what they want to hear, is here's how you can help.
So overall, I hear you suggesting 2 distinct steps here. The first being to stop focusing mostly on other people's image of you and instead focus on making sure they get what they want in their interaction with you. The second is to break off small pieces of getting them what they want, turn it into a skill you can focus on developing, and then obsess about that skill for a while.
That, I'd be happy to take the way if you went like that. Right?
And just the obsession part in particular made me think I want to make sure I'm not just sitting down and thinking about making sure other people have a great security experience, but I'm actually breaking off pieces, building useful skills and intuitions about them.
That's right.
And obsessing in small pieces.
That's right. What I'm not leaving you with is what it means to be an InfoSec craftsman. That's a whole nother set of hour-long discussion or whatever it is, and especially because you have many different InfoSec craftsmen, in my opinion. It moves beyond just the very simple blue team, red team categories. So first and foremost, it's thinking about what you do and being a craftsman. And then comes what you actually mentioned first, which is focusing on the customer, right? And their experience and how they digest it.
What I've come across from this is I used to do a lot of work in theater. And security and IT is kind of like the stage crew. You know, our customer is kind of the actors and the director.
That's right.
But what we're not, we want to please them enough so that they can give a good experience to the audience. You know, when tech goes exactly right, the audience is like, oh my God, you know, did you see the whatever on the costume? Did you hear the voice of the singer? Did you whatever? And tech is exactly 100% transparent.
That's right.
When it's not, people are like, oh my God, can you believe that show? It would have been really good, except, you know, the spotlight person wasn't on where they were supposed to be. You could never hear that guy in the back, and you couldn't do this, and the lighting was horrible because you couldn't see this. And then you become the focus, where your job there is to be as transparent as absolutely possible.
That's right. Like, so anybody familiar with the Broadway Spider-Man debacle? Right? So yeah. So that's what everybody came away with talking about, was like, okay, so that sucked because X, Y, and Z, right? And the X, Y, and Z were definitely were a lot of these operational things. Nobody ever said that person's a bad actor. They said that person was given a crap script and the special effects didn't come off and all that stuff.
But is no visibility kind of bad for you, right? Because if people start seeing that, hey, if things aren't secured properly, then, you know, here's an effect, right? But if everything goes perfect, then does the CFO, CEO go, hey, everything's perfect. Why are we, you know, X, let's cut back on. So is some visibility good versus?
So I would argue that egoless visibility is good. Again, the goal here is that the whole mindset shift is be okay if there is no visibility, right? Because that's where when I said I had a Western view of it, it's, hey, here's Alex and he's got a bow tie on. He's going to tell you all about the risk, Mr. CEO. And isn't he awesome? Isn't he valuable? Shouldn't you give him a raise? Right? It was my expectation. And when that didn't happen in my career, I felt frustrated. Like, don't these people know I'm Alex freaking Hutton, right? You know. So it is sort of that. And the other thing I'd like in that example, I'd like you to understand is when the CEO comes and says, "Can't I cut?" He's not doing it just because he's like those SOBs in security, right? He's doing it because he wants cash from here to put over there. And sometimes we can give him that, and sometimes we can't. Again, this is not a panacea. It's not a way to get CEO buy-in. It's not a way to do anything. It's a way to say, when I do get a 10% cut, I'm not going to go out and have, you know, and get heartburn and frustration and ulcers and take it out on my family or you know, take it out on a bottle of Jack Daniels. It's it's more about okay, that's going to happen. That's part of life. What I'm going to do is continue to focus on what's important to me is the fact that I'm a craftsman. JIRO's got like that, 8-month wait for customers. Not all his customers are sushi connoisseurs. I'd go in and I would have no freaking clue what I'm eating. I promise you, right? I would know the difference between his sushi. Well, I wouldn't know the difference between his and supermarket sushi, I'm sure. But you get the picture, right? I would not be ready to appreciate that. And sometimes those are just going to be who we are, or who we're dealing with.
I got the impression there that you're saying you lower your blood pressure by focusing less on what they should do in a moral sense and more about cause and effect. If you do this, if you open up this, you're going to cause this. If you add these controls, then this will happen.
My goal is to help them, is to create an experience where they feel like they've made the best decision possible. I can't control the decision. I just can't. If we've got profit problems and the CEO needs to cut budget by 10% across the board, when I was at Verizon, every quarter they'd be like, hey, find the bottom 5% and we fire their butts, right? I can't control that. What I can control is that moment, right, where I present them, like you're saying, cause and effects, and how I present the cause and effects. Right? And again, we're talking at a C level right now. This can be applicable if you're in the SOC and you're talking about us versus the network guys, right? My experience has been that it's applicable to think this way. Well, I think we might be over.
It's lunch, so it doesn't matter.
What's that?
We're at lunchtime, so it doesn't
Okay.
matter.
All right. All right, well, thanks very much for showing up. I appreciate it.
All right, now go away, find food, and come back.
Do you think we could add Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to the B-side to Orlando to get